Okay then, so thanks for watching that spontaneous D&D video I made yesterday. I mean, if you didn't, it's cool. I know it's a departure from what I normally discuss, but it was a lot of fun to make. It's good to do something different every once in a while, and I got pretty positive reception from it, so who knows, I might make another one. But for right now, we're going back to One Piece. How far back, you may ask? Oh, well, in case you're the kind of person that doesn't like to read titles or thumbnails before you click on videos, we're hitting the Wayback Machine way back on this one. Before the Void Century itself to Before the Void. Which is, ironically, we know less about the time before the Void Century than the Void Century itself. And the whole reason we don't know a lot about the Void Century, because it's literally called the Void Century, because the government's trying to suppress that information. So that raises an eyebrow a little bit. Like, is the government only concerned about this one century in particular? Or are they also trying to suppress other information from other time periods? And from what I've realized, the answer is yes to that. It seems like the Void Century is where a lot of this crazy stuff went down that the government doesn't want the rest of the world to know about. So absolutely under no circumstances can anybody be teaching this stuff or trying to learn about this stuff, because the government will find you, the cipher pool will find you, and they will lock that down right away. However, I was thinking the other day, because I've had this theory for a while, and I've mentioned this before in other videos. I've gone into more detail with it there. I did a whole video about the Void Century, but let me just give you the abridged version. I believe that before the Void Century happened, the One Piece world at large was a technologically advanced, I don't want to say utopia, but it was definitely more industrialized than it is right now. Now, I understand there's some islands like the future land of Baltimore and places like that that have a lot more advanced technology there, but I'm not just talking about one or two islands scattered all over the world. I'm talking about the whole world at large was way more technologically advanced than it is right now. Then the Void Century happened, the world government took over, they maybe utilized the ancient weapons in some way, or they captured them from the ancient kingdom, they utilized them, they, destroyed the world to the point where it now is regressed back into this technological, inferiority to when it was before, and the world government rules over it, and it's a lot easier for them to rule over it now, because it doesn't have, there might have been, flying machines and stuff back in the day, and that stuff doesn't exist anymore, and the world government rules over it. Obviously, the WG would not want the citizens of the world to know what they did, because they would probably be upset about that, right? They could have not, going beyond just machines, going beyond just having flying machines and stuff, there could have been advances in, medical technology before the Void Century. They might have been able to cure all these really, chronic diseases, and now that technology, that information's all been lost. They might have had technology, concurrent with us right now, and this doesn't exist anymore. So, the citizens would definitely be upset if it was the world government that did all that. So that's something they want to absolutely make sure to keep on the lockdown. Now, whether or not this theory is true or not, it stands to reason that the government would not just want people to, not find out about the Void Century, but any time before that. Because, if somebody tries to study the world 900 years ago when the Void Century began, world government's going to be on you. And he's like, oh, okay, what if I don't try to study about the world 900 years ago? I just want to study about the world 1,000 years ago. You think the world government would be okay with that? Be like, oh, okay, it's okay to study history as long as it's not this one specific century. Because just by going along with, how history works, if you study what happened 1,000 years ago, that's probably going to connect back in some way to what was going on in the Void Century, right? If somebody's opening up a history book and studying what happened 1,000 years ago, and it's like, there was this great kingdom that ruled over the entire world. Some pages are missing because of the Void Century. 800 years ago, the world government now controls the entire world, and there's no mention of that ancient kingdom at all. Huh! I wonder what happened there. So I don't think it's just the Void Century. The government is going to try to lock down any information from, the Void Century when it started and ended all the way back, as far back as they could. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if they went all, Fahrenheit 451 with this. During the Void Century, when the government took over, they gathered up as many history books as they could in a time before that, and they just burned them, and they just got rid of them, okay? Now, obviously, the poneglyphs would survive. The poneglyphs were created around the same time as the Void Century, and there were the things like the ruins that Robin found at Skypiea, and talking about Shandora, it mentioned years and dates that were well before the Void Century, okay? Now, there's only been a few mentions of a time period before the Void Century in the One Piece world, and there's not very many of them, so I'll just go through them right now, okay? So 900 years ago, Void Century begins. 1,000 years ago was the mention of Zunisha beginning to roam the seas, or rather, minks began to set up their culture on top of Zunisha 1,000 years ago. I originally assumed that meant the elephant was 1,000 years old, like Zunisha was born 1,000 years ago. But what it seems like when going back and actually reading through it, it seems like no, Zunisha is actually more than 1,000 years old, and 1,000 years ago is when it was big enough for the culture to actually exist on its back, the entire country of Zo. So that was 1,000 years ago, okay? 1,100 years ago is when Shandora was built and began to prosper, the city of gold, El Dorado, whatever you want to call it, right? That, of course, was founded by the Shandians in Jaya, and then, much later, 400 years before the current storyline, that's when it got blasted into the sky. But long before that, when the sky races came down from the moon and they reached Jaya, they created Shandora. That was on the Blue Sea. That was 1,100 years ago, okay? 4,000 years ago is how old the palace at Alubarna was stated to be. The palace was constructed in Alabasta 4,000 years ago, or Alubarna in Alabasta, okay? And because Alabasta, a lot of the stuff there harkens back to ancient Egyptian mythology and stuff, like, Pel is a falcon, and he's the guardian deity of Alabasta, right? Okay, so it makes sense, like, going back that far back in our world, ancient Egyptian, talking like maybe 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years, something like that around the level. Okay, so 4,000 years ago, the palace at Alubarna was constructed, and then the furthest back so far we know in One Piece, like the furthest back anything has been mentioned, 5,000 years ago, the Tree of Knowledge at Ohara was planted. Alright, so the Tree of Knowledge, this giant tree, well, at least it used to be a giant tree. It's really honestly sad when you learn about it from this perspective. 5,000-year-old tree dedicated to storing the knowledge of the world within its trunk, and the world government just Buster calls it into oblivion. That's really sad. Doesn't that make you cry? It's like the destruction of the ancient library of Alexandria. It's just like, damn it! Why of that place of all places? Why did it have to be a library that you Buster called, right? Ah, man. It could have been like a giant statue, and of course that would have sucked to lose a giant statue. Like, this is the mighty giant statue of our great creator god. And you Buster call that into oblivion. I'm like, alright, well that sucks. That's an archaeological marvel, like one of the 7 wonders of the world or wherever, that gets destroyed, but it had to be a library of all things, right? Damn it. Okay, so anyway, though, 5,000 years ago, that's as far as back as we can go. Now, because Oda is obviously so focused on the Void Century and what went down there, involving the Will of D, the poneglyphs, the ancient weapons, the Great Kingdom that apparently ruled over the world before the world government, the founding of the world government itself, all the 20 kings that came together to create the damn thing, the whole thing with Joy Boy and the ancient weapon Poseidon, the mermaid princess back then. Obviously, Oda is going to be doing a flashback involving the Void Century at some point, so I don't really think Oda is going to focus too tremendously much on everything that happened before that, but I still think just as a connection, it has to be mentioned at some point, right? Maybe when we do a flashback to the Void Century, in that flashback, they'll mention events that happened like thousands of years ago and stuff. Or if we ever have something involving the sky races coming down from the moon and, establishing Shandora, the City of Gold, or maybe there might be a backstory involved with that. I'm not really sure if we're going to go back to the whole City of Gold thing, because that was the whole focus of the Skypiea and the Jaya arc, but maybe, who knows, we might go back to it someday. But alright, let's start by discussing how the world government would tackle this, how the world government would explain the history of the world to their people. So imagine you are a member of the Gorosei, alright, and the citizens are curious about, like, what happened in the past. They can't ask questions about the Void Century, but, people are just genuinely curious about, like, okay, what was the world like before the world government? I mean, I guess the Gorosei and the government could just say, don't ask any questions, but I don't think that would be the way they would go about it. No, a more advantageous route for the world government would just be to spread propaganda all over the place. You gotta tell your citizens something, but it's probably gonna go along somewhere along this line of reasoning. It's gonna be like, before the world government, the world was this horrible place, but then the world government took over and everything was happiness and sunshine and rainbows and kittens, and Skittles would rain from the sky for a million years. Like, that's a little bit hyperbolic. They're probably going to dial it down a little bit on the kittens and the Skittles, especially if you don't like Skittles. I personally like Skittles. The green ones are the best. But no, you know what I mean. Like, they're going to tell them something about how, oh yeah, obviously, yeah, we can't tell anything particular about the Void Century, because they would probably say the reason you can't study the Void Century is like there's information there that's like really dangerous if you ever learned about it, or they might just lie and say that information from that era is all gone. It's just there's no books from that era, and anybody like the scholars at O'Hara like Clover is like, actually we did find documents and poneglyphs from that era. No, you didn't. Okay, cleanup operation. Yeah, those people at O'Hara, yeah, crazy what happened to them, right? And nuts. So, yeah, they're going to probably tell them something like that. It's like, oh, yeah, before the world government existed, all the countries of the world were embroiled in this constant war, and it was raging for thousands and thousands and thousands of years of just constant warfare. The ground was scorched, with just, ash, and all the trees were burned down, and all of the pastures were just completely ruined, and the streams dried up, and it was this horrible hellscape, this dystopia to live in. No human being could possibly live in that environment. But then the world government, the founders arrived, and they decided that it's enough is enough, and we shall stop this violence. And they got together at Marijwa, and they united, and they caused all the countries of the world to quell and put down their arms, and they united them all under one banner. And then that's how the world government's, that's how awesome we are. Probably going to be something along that line of rhetoric, that line of reasoning, right? And if anybody tried to press even further than that, if anybody tried to find some history books or tried to study about what happened to collaborate the government's story, that's when they would probably get the cipher pole involved. That's when they would probably... You know what the really sad thing is? There might actually be some genuine, curious scholars in the One Piece world that are just trying to learn more about the world, and they might try to go... They might be very naive in it, and I'm sure the government covered up the story of O'Hara and everything too. I don't think the government was going to be saying something like, the citizens of O'Hara were about to discover the history of the Void Century and ruin the world government's reputation, so we decided to Buster Call them into oblivion. No, I think the world government spun it with O'Hara. It's like, they were researching really dangerous things, and they were trying to do something to like destroy the world government from within or something, and that's the reason we got rid of them. So there might be some actual other scholars in the world from lands other than O'Hara that might be like, hey, I'm going to try to learn about the history of the world. I'm not going to be like those scholars of O'Hara. I'm not going to try to research weapons or anything. I'm just going to research about the history. Same thing what the O'Harans were doing, but they don't know that. It's like, try to get access to Marijwa. Hey, I would like to gain access to Marijwa to research in your library, please. Sure, beep, come on up. Yeah, sure, come on up. Let's see, we have full access to our library. I'm like, oh, thank you so much. I am a scholar. I'm a professor at this university. Does One Piece have universities? Probably somewhere. Be like, I just like to study and learn about the world. Oh, no, of course, yes, we understand. Well, go in the head in the library. Actually, you know what you can do? Go in that very far back room. Oh, the room with no lights? Yeah, the room with no lights. Don't worry, the lights are automatic. They turn on when the door shuts. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. You lock the door. That guy's probably never going to get out of there. He's going to spend the rest of his life in a jail cell or just be, right there. Okay, so there's genuinely curious people that dig a little bit too deep, and it's like, they don't come back. If they're very dedicated to their craft, then, they're actually in danger of learning the history. The government just cuts them off like O'Harans, but I imagine there's maybe other people that are just starting to research. The cipher pole gets word of it. They approach them, probably give them a warning. It'd just be like, hey, we heard you were researching, the city of Shandora 1,100 years ago. It's like, oh, yes, I was. I'm like, records from that era are mostly lost. Right, I understand that, but I actually discovered some ruins that might... Records from that era are mostly lost, and that's probably a good thing. Oh, yes. So I hope that we won't ever have to meet again. I'm sure the cipher pole might give out warnings and stuff. It's just like, you can't let somebody study the world before the Void Century, because that's going to lead into thing. In fact, honestly, I could even see the world government back during the Void Century creating fake history books and then distributing them to the world. You could see that, couldn't you? Like, let's say you find an ancient book in a library from 700 years ago after the Void Century, but it's not real history. It was fake history that the government created so someone maybe could find hundreds of years ago, so it just collaborates their story even more. It's like, oh yeah, this old dusty book that I found in Grandpa's attic. yeah, it talks about the world being all washed in, war and devastation, and then the world government, oh, it's all right here. Yeah, crazy. And this book's 700 years old. Nuts. And hey, you know what? Taking it even one step further than that, the world government, I mean, it really is a perfect example of history is written by the victors. Because the world government wouldn't even have to be truthful with the dates. They could make a fake history book and distribute it into the world, and the history might say, oh, this is the history of the world, 1,200 years ago, when in reality it was only written 700 years ago, and they're not including any of the history 1,200 years ago. The government could just lie. They could just lie. It's like, oh yes, 1,500 years ago, the Doodle Dip Kingdom, attacked the Flutterbopper Kingdom, and then they raged on for 600 years until the world government stopped them because they're so great. So really, they can make fake history from as far back as they want, and they could throw in as many dates as they want because they're the ones that control all this propaganda. So it's like, yeah, I could see the government doing that as well. So it's probably it's a big operation in order to keep this secret. I'm sure most people in the One Piece world are not scholars and they don't really care. Most islands are probably just like little farming communities, It's just like, oh, yeah, we're just a humble little farming community here, just, tilling the fields, for the heavenly tribute and all that stuff. Gotta work your back off. That's what you gotta do. They're probably not interested in even learning about what happened in the Void Century or before that or anything like that. There's no reason for them to, right? But those few people, like the Oharans and Robin and the few other scholars that I'm sure are scattered all over the world. I'm sure some of them, I would like to think that some Oharans managed to survive. I don't like to think that every single scholar of Ohara was on the island when it got burned down by the Buster Call. There were probably some other scholars, or some other architects, all over, not architects, archaeologists. Well, hey, I'm sure there were architects and archaeologists on Ohara, okay, but anyway, I'm sure there was other archaeologists studying ruins in some far-off corner of the world somewhere when they heard the news that Ohara was destroyed, and they probably knew right away why it was. It's like, oh man, they figured it, they found the poneglyphs, that's the reason why they did it. Oh man. And so I like to think that maybe there's other scholars that are living underground, like literally underground. They might be living in caves or whatever, so the government can't find them because they probably have wanted posters out for them, right? The same way that Robin got a wanted poster at the age of just 8. All right, so yeah, that's the angle the world government's going to take it, okay? But in reality, I think it's just like, yeah, they got as many scrolls and books as they could that talked about the world history before that. They burned them, got rid of them, and started manufacturing their own history, okay? Now, where would this information be where they couldn't have reached it? Well, obviously we know the Sky Islands are one location. The Sky Islands are actually a perfect place for history to be preserved because the world government doesn't have authority over that place. And you have the moon as well. Beyond that, the moon is also a place that has like all those in this ancient city of Bricka. Inside of the moon has those pictograms and stuff of the moon races going to Earth. But there was also some script there that was similar to poneglyph script. Eneru couldn't read it, but I'm sure Robin could. Here's a question: where did the poneglyph language come from? That's a question, because it's a language that only a few people right now in the present day of the story can read or interpret, Robin being one of them. So you can't just say it was a language maybe derived from another language or something. The poneglyph language seems to be completely detached. It seems to be a language that's unlike any other language in the One Piece world, so you can't even really piece it together. It's like only Robin and a few other people were ever even capable of reading the damn things, okay? So, where did the language come from? We know the stones themselves were created by the stonemason Kozuki clan. I guess back in the day, they were like a stonemason group, and they could like carve the stones. This special sea prism stone, I'm assuming, because they came from Wano, because they're a Kozuki clan, and it's supposed to be this unbreakable stone that can only be molded and etched into in the land of Wano. So that's probably they're made out of sea prism, right? Or maybe something similar to sea prism. There's sea prism in them, maybe. Something has to make them as nigh indestructible as they are, right? So the Kozuki clan were the ones that were etching that language in, but where did that language come from? I mean, you could just say it's a language that was used in ancient Wano, and that's where they got it from, but I don't like to think that. I think it was an ancient language that probably originated from the moon or the sky races, probably the moon, because everything ties back to the moon, right? And it's this alien language that only maybe a few people on the Blue Sea were able to learn about, and that knowledge was passed down through a long line of archaeologists and scholars until it eventually arrived at, Olvia, and then Robin, they can read it. Okay, makes sense, right? So yeah, the language language itself, I don't think originated from Wano. The stones did, and the substance did, but not the language. So maybe Shandora. If you want to point to anything directly, maybe that was a language that was used in Shandora. Interesting note about that, the kingdom of Shandora, the city of gold of legend, apparently fell from grace 800 years ago. Now, let me explain this, okay? Because what are you saying 800 years ago? I thought Noland and Kalgara, they had their whole thing 400 years ago, and the City of Gold was there. Yes, they did. However, it wasn't very prosperous at that point, okay? The Shandians were a little bit more dwindled at that point. Moon people started on the moon. The Brickens and the Skypians arrived in the sky. The Shandians made it all the way to the ocean. Founded Jaya, founded the City of Gold, El Dorado. 1100 years ago is when that was built, and that began to prosper. And then for the next 300 years, El Dorado, Shandora, was this brilliant metropolis of gold. Hub for commerce and travel and all that kind of stuff. Then the Void Century happened, and then 800 years ago was when it apparently collapsed. It was still there, but the culture had died from where it was. So by the time Nolan, met with Kalgra and everything, yeah, that was a city of gold, but it was kind of falling into more ruins at that point. And then 400 years ago, it got blasted into the sky, and then, its upper yard, and then we all know what happened from that point onward, because we explore that in the Skypiea arc. But yeah, so it was way more of an impressive city at that point. World government took over, and then probably wiped it out or destroyed it and reduced it to a state where it's not it can't be on the same level of like a hub of commerce where it was before. It doesn't have a large economy as it used to. World government takes over, right? Now, there's also talks about that great kingdom or that ancient kingdom. The ancient kingdom is apparently the kingdom that ruled over the world before the world government did. Apparently this kingdom was so huge. It's like the British Empire back in the day. It was probably like the sun never sets on the great kingdom, whatever the name of that great kingdom was, right? The world government were enemies of this great kingdom, and apparently the ancient weapons were created in this great kingdom. Maybe at some point the world government took the ancient weapons from them. Or we don't know. We like to assume the great kingdom are the good guys in this context, and the world government is the bad guys. Hell, it might turn out like the great kingdom were the bad guys, and the world government were the bad guys, and it's just like the world government just happened to win. That might be the twist here. It's just like, it's not as simple as just good versus evil. Sometimes it's evil versus evil. Evil wins. You could say if it was the lesser of two evils or what, but it's still not a good situation to be in, right? And that's the whole deal, of course, right now with Dragon and the Revolutionary Army trying to get rid of the Tenryubito system and reform the world government. But yeah, so this ancient kingdom existed before then. The world government doesn't want anybody knowing about the kingdom, probably because it would lead them to finding out more about the ancient weapons or where they're hidden. 800 years of absolute rule that the world government has had, and they apparently do not have access to any of these ancient weapons. They probably at least have an idea about Shirahoshi being Poseidon, because she just awoke her powers recently within the last few decades, and Eam apparently, he took the knife through Shirahoshi's picture, so he apparently knows what's going on with Shirahoshi. Uranus or Uranus or whatever you want to call it, that's apparently gone. We don't know where that is. I'm thinking it's on the moon. Pluton's location was given at Alabasta, and it's also, we saw the blueprints for it at Water 7. So Pluton seems to be, right now, the most devastating one that the world government would want to get their hands on, because it's just a machine, apparently it is. Shirahoshi, you kind of have to control through other means, because she's a living mermaid, right? Not impossible to control her, but it's a lot easier probably just to find a machine of destruction and just pilot it. All right. I feel like if the world government had access to Pluton, then the pirates wouldn't be a problem. The Yonko wouldn't be a problem. The supernovas wouldn't be a problem. The Revolutionary Army wouldn't be a problem. Nothing would be a problem. They would bust that thing out and destroy whatever faction they wanted to destroy and then call it a day. To be fair, they probably don't want to do that very often, because the more time you use that thing, maybe the more time people might realize, like, hey, maybe we could try to figure out a way to take over that, ancient weapon ourselves. So you probably don't want to bust out Pluton for every minor threat. But you'd think they would certainly want to use it against the freaking Yonko. It's just like Kaido and Big Mom and Shanks and Viper. You think they would definitely want to, bust out Pluton if they had access to it and use it. Now, you might be asking, well, they clearly don't have Pluton. They want Pluton because they were looking for the blueprints they had at Eni's lobby. Sure, but I'm just saying, even if they had access to Pluton, they would still want the blueprints, because the whole point of the blueprints was to make a second Pluton to destroy the first one in case it got in the wrong hands. So, I'm just saying, it would make sense if the world government got their hands on Pluton, or they've had it for a while, they don't want anybody to know about this, only the Gorosei, like, Eam would know about it. And it's like, hey, we found out that there's blueprints for to make Pluton at Water 7 in case, we use this one. It's like, oh, okay, we'll send the Cypher Pole to find them and destroy them or capture them. That way we could at least, we don't have to worry about somebody else, making a Pluton for themselves. So even if they did have it, they would still want those blueprints, no matter what, right? And hey, the Gorosei were talking about that great cleansing at one point, so maybe that's like, oh, we bust out the ancient weapon and use that. But yeah, I feel like they don't have an ancient weapon. I'm just saying, 800 years of absolute power in the world, they would be a group that would be very likely to have the ancient weapon or find where it is. Maybe they know where it is, but they can't get to it for some reason. Also, with the fourth road poneglyph, it's just like if any organization would be likely to have that, once again, the world government has agents everywhere. They might have discovered the fourth poneglyph, and they might be keeping it at Marijois or someplace. Who knows? Now, that doesn't mean that the Straw Hats have to go to Marijois to get it. Maybe Shanks might have a copy of the rubbing of it or something like that. There might be another way to find out what the fourth road poneglyph says without actually seeing it in front of you and making the etchings yourself, or Robin reading it herself. But, I'm just saying, the world government has all these resources. It's not ridiculous to claim they might know where the ancient weapon is, and they just can't get to it, or they have it but they don't like to use it very often unless they really need to, unless they enact a cleansing every few hundred years, and after the cleansing nobody's going to remember that they had it anyway. Not something that they would bust out normally. They might have the fourth road poneglyph, and they might have to, the Straw Hats might have to find other means to get it. It's not impossible, right? Yeah, I just want to do a video about that today. I'm also going to be, maybe when I'm going to do some more research into the Ancient Kingdom and some theories I've seen, and maybe I can make a video about that. But it's just one of those things that's really ambiguous in that sense, like what the Ancient Kingdom or the Great Kingdom even was. So I'll look more into that and see where that goes. But thanks for watching, everybody. This will be Tekking101 signing out.